The world had shrunk to the color of bone. White sky, white ground, white wind that screamed and tore at the canvas of the overturned wagon. Eleanor Ashford had stopped feeling the cold an hour ago, which she knew was a bad sign. The numbness was a liar, a soft voice promising rest when it meant only the long, final sleep. Her fingers, tucked inside a threadbare coat, were useless sticks. Her feet were stones. Kansas was a distant memory, a stifling room she had fled only to find a cage made of ice. She had pushed against the splintered wagon box until her shoulders ached, trying to find shelter. But the wind drove the snow in sideways, filling every space. Now, she simply sat, huddled against a wheel, her breathing a shallow puff of white in the air. This was it. Then, a foolish escape. A desperate run ending in a quiet freeze. She had wanted freedom, and the vast, merciless wilderness of Wyoming had given her an excess of it, an emptiness so complete it was about to swallow her whole. She closed her eyes. It would be easier to just let go. Then, through the howl of the wind, came a sound, a rhythmic, muffled thump. At first, she thought it was the panicked beat of her own heart, but it was too steady. Too heavy. Thump, thump, thump. It grew louder, a sound of life in a world of white death. Her eyes snapped open. She tried to push herself up, her legs refusing to cooperate. She managed to get to her knees, peering into the swirling curtain of snow. A shape emerged from the whiteout, dark and immense. A horse, black as coal, its head low against the storm, plumes of steam jetting from its nostrils, and on its back, a rider, a mountain of a man wrapped in oilskin and furs, his hat pulled low. He was just a silhouette, a looming shadow against the snow. Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through Eleanor's numbness. A man, out here. Men were the reason she had fled Kansas, the reason she was freezing to death in the first place. The horse stopped a few feet away. It stood rock steady, as if carved from the same dark stone as the mountains hidden by the storm. The man did not speak. He simply watched her for a long moment, his face obscured by shadow and a thick, dark beard frosted with ice. Eleanor's breath hitched. She could not run. She could barely move. He swung a leg over the saddle and slid to the ground. He moved with a quiet economy. No wasted motion. He was tall, broader than any man she had ever seen up close. He walked toward her, his boots crunching in the snow. Each step was a lifetime. She flinched as he knelt, expecting a rough hand, a harsh word. Instead, he just looked at the overturned wagon, then back at her. His eyes, she could see them now under the brim of his hat, were a clear, steady gray. Like a winter sky after the storm has passed. They held no judgment, no pity, just a quiet assessment of the situation. He reached out, not for her, but to gently touch the cracked wood of the wagon wheel she huddled against. His hands were huge, covered in thick leather gloves. "This will not last the night," he said. His voice was low and rough, like stones rubbing together, but it was not unkind. It was a statement of fact. Eleanor could not find her own voice. She could only nod. A tiny, jerky movement. He straightened up. "Come." It was not a command so much as an invitation to the only sensible choice. He turned and walked back to his horse, expecting her to follow. She tried to stand, but her legs buckled. A wave of dizziness and shame washed over her. So weak. He was there in an instant, turning back as if he had sensed her fall before it happened. He did not say anything about her weakness. He simply bent, slid one powerful arm under her knees and the other behind her back, and lifted her as if she weighed nothing more than a sack of flour. The shock of being held was a jolt to her system. Her body went rigid. Her mind screamed with old fears, memories of being grabbed, of being held down. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the worst. But his hold was impersonal, practical. He carried her to the horse. his movements sure and steady. He smelled of pine, wet wool, and cold air. It was a clean, wild smell. He mounted the horse with a grunt of effort, settling her in front of him, her back against his solid chest. The heat from his body was a shock, a profound and startling warmth that seeped through her frozen coat. He wrapped a corner of his oilskin cloak around her, tucking it in tight. "Hold on," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. He nudged the horse with his heels, and the great black animal turned and began to walk, stepping sure-footedly back into the blinding snow. Eleanor did not know how long they rode. Time had dissolved in the swirling white. She was aware only of the rhythmic plodding of the horse, the screaming wind, and the impossible, life-giving heat at her back. The man behind her was a silent wall, shielding her from the worst of the storm. She was leaning against a stranger, a man of terrifying size. Yet she felt a flicker of something she had not felt in years, a fragile sense of safety. She was too exhausted, too cold to fight it. She let her head fall back against his shoulder and drifted into a state that was not quite sleep, but a surrender to the motion and the warmth. She was roused when the horse stopped. The wind was not as loud here. She opened her eyes and saw they were in the lee of a massive rock face, a sheer cliff of granite that rose into the storm. Tucked against it was a simple lean-to, a heavy canvas tarp stretched over a frame of pine logs. It was a crude shelter, but it broke the wind. A small stack of firewood lay nearby, covered by another piece of canvas. He dismounted, then gently lifted her down. Her legs were still useless, and she would have fallen if he had not held her steady. He guided her under the canvas and sat her down on a thick pile of pine boughs covered with a buffalo robe. The scent of pine was even stronger in here, sharp and clean. He went back outside without a word. Through the opening, she watched him tend to his horse, rubbing the animal down with a briskness that spoke of long habit and deep care. He removed the saddle and blanket, then led the horse to a slightly more sheltered spot under an overhang. Giving it a feed bag of oats, the horse was his partner in this wilderness. That much was clear. Only then did he turn his attention to the fire. He worked with a methodical grace, clearing a small pit, arranging kindling with his big gloved hands. He struck a flint and steel, and after a few tries, a tiny spark caught on the tinder. He blew on it gently, coaxing it, nurturing it. A small flame wavered, then grew stronger, catching on the twigs. Soon, a proper fire was crackling, pushing back the oppressive cold and casting dancing shadows on the rock wall. He came back under the shelter and hung a small pot over the fire. He scooped snow into it with a tin cup, then settled back on his heels, watching the snow melt. He still had not asked her name, where she was from, or what had happened. The silence was a space he gave her, a gift she did not know she needed until it was offered. Prying questions would have felt like a violation, another claim made upon her. His quiet respect for her privacy was more comforting than any words of reassurance could have been. When the water was warm, he poured some into the tin cup and handed it to her. "Drink," he said. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold it. He noticed and knelt in front of her, taking the cup in his own hands and holding it to her lips. She drank, the warmth spreading through her chest, a painful, wonderful thawing. He did not rush her, waiting patiently until she had finished. He then took out a strip of dried venison from a leather pouch and offered it to her. It was tough and salty, but it was food. She chewed it slowly, the act of eating an anchor to the living world. The fire crackled, the wind moaned outside the shelter, and the two of them sat in a small circle of light and warmth, strangers bound by a storm. As darkness fell, the cold deepened, creeping back into the shelter despite the fire. The temperature was plummeting. Eleanor could feel it in her bones, a deep, invasive chill that the fire could not fully banish. Her coat was still damp, her thin dress useless against this kind of cold. The man seemed to feel it too. He added more wood to the fire, then turned his attention to the sleeping arrangement. He had only one thick bedroll, made of heavy wool blankets and more furs. He spread it out on the pine boughs, on the side of the fire opposite where she sat. It was large, clearly big enough for 2 people. The unspoken implication hung in the air. He looked at her, his gray eyes unreadable in the firelight. "We will need to share the warmth," he stated. Again, without inflection, it was a matter of survival. "Or one of us will likely freeze before morning." Panic, cold and familiar, fluttered in Eleanor's stomach. To lie beside him, to be that close, that vulnerable. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to take her chances with the cold. The cold was a clean death. Men were a different kind of danger. He seemed to read the terror in her face. He held up a hand, not to touch her, but to stop her unspoken protest. "You have my word," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "No harm will come to you." He looked away from her then, toward the fire, as if to give her space to think. "I will lie down first. The choice to join is yours." He took off his heavy oilskin coat but left on his other layers. He lay down on the far side of the bedroll, his broad back to the space where she would lie. He pulled a corner of the blanket over himself and then lay perfectly still, a silent mountain range in the flickering light. Eleanor watched him for a long time. He did not move. He did not look back. He was giving her the power, the control. He had saved her life, brought her to shelter, given her food and warmth. And now he was offering her a choice that felt more significant than any she had ever been given. It was a choice about trust. The cold was a persuasive argument. It bit at her ankles, her wrists, the back of her neck. Shivers racked her body. She looked at the fire, then at the still form of the man. He had called her bluff. He had laid out the terms of survival and left the final move to her. He was not a man of promises, but of actions. He had found her in the storm. He had carried her. He had built the fire. His action said he was a man who did what was necessary and what was right. Slowly, hesitantly, she made her way over to the bedroll. Her movements were stiff, her whole body a protest. She lay down on the edge of the furs, as far from him as she could get, her own back to his. She pulled a piece of the heavy wool blanket over her shoulder. The space between them was a chasm of cold air. She could feel him, a solid presence just inches away. She held her breath, waiting. He did not move. He did not shift closer. He did not even seem to breathe. He was a wall of stone and stillness. The cold was relentless. Her shivering grew worse. Finally, logic won out over fear. With a trembling sigh, she shifted closer, just an inch, until the wool of her coat brushed against the wool of his shirt. The warmth was immediate. It was a current of life, flowing from his large body into her own. It was not an invasive heat, but a steady, radiating comfort. Her shivering began to subside. The heat from his back was a barrier against the cold that pressed in from all sides. It was safety. She lay there, her back pressed lightly against his, listening to the lonely sound of the wind. She could feel the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest as he breathed. It was a calming rhythm, the sound of a life that was quiet, strong, and blessedly uncomplicated. For the first time since leaving Kansas, the frantic terror in her own heart began to quiet. She was still a stranger in a wild land, lying beside a man she did not know. But for tonight, she was not alone in the storm, and as she finally drifted into a deep, exhausted sleep, that felt like enough. She woke to silence, not the roaring, oppressive silence of the snow, but a deep, peaceful quiet that felt as if the world were holding its breath. The wind was gone, light, clear, and sharp, filtered through the canvas of the lean-to, painting the interior a soft gray. She was stiff and sore, her muscles protesting every small movement, but she was warm. She was alive. She turned her head slowly. The man was already awake. Crouched by the fire pit where a small, clean fire burned with hardly any smoke. He was tending a battered tin coffee pot that sat nestled in the coals. He moved with the same quiet purpose she had seen before, his large frame economical and sure. He had taken off his gloves, and she saw his hands for the first time. They were large and calloused, the knuckles scarred, but their movements were surprisingly gentle as he checked the pot. He seemed to feel her gaze and looked over. His gray eyes were steady, revealing nothing. He gave a slight nod, a simple acknowledgement that she was awake, then turned his attention back to the coffee. The gesture was oddly comforting. He was not a man who would fuss. Eleanor pushed herself into a sitting position, the buffalo robe pooling around her waist. She felt a flush of embarrassment, remembering the intimacy of the night, the simple necessity of sharing his warmth. She had slept pressed against a stranger, yet he had made no move, offered no threat. He had simply existed beside her, a warm and solid presence in the dark. He poured a black, steaming liquid from the pot into the single tin cup. He walked over and offered it to her. The aroma was rich and dark, a scent of civilization in this wild place. "I never thanked you," she said, her voice a rough whisper. He did not reply, merely waited for her to take the cup. Her hands were steadier now, and she took it from him. The metal was hot against her palms. She took a sip. The coffee was strong, bitter, and utterly without sweetness, but the heat of it was a welcome shock. It felt like drinking the truth. "I do not even know your name," she said, looking up at him as he stood over her. "Wyatt," he answered. The name was like him, short, solid, and plain. She took another sip of coffee, gathering her courage. "And who is Wyatt?" He considered the question for a moment. His gaze directed past her toward the bright opening of the shelter. The light glinted in his frosty beard. When he finally answered, his voice was low and even. "Someone who does not leave people in a storm." The words settled in the quiet air between them. It was not the answer she had expected. It was not a profession or a history. It was a principle. It was everything she needed to know. It was a promise made not to her, but to himself. A promise he had kept. Eleanor looked down into her cup, a strange knot forming in her throat. For the first time, she felt a flicker not of safety born from desperation, but of genuine trust. When they had finished the last of the dried venison and he had drunk his coffee straight from the pot, he began to pack. He moved with the swift efficiency of a man accustomed to making and breaking camp. The bedroll was tied tight. The pot and cup were secured. The canvas lean-to was folded into a compact square. In minutes, all evidence of their small haven was gone, except for the dying embers of the fire. He led the great black horse over. Eleanor expected him to lift her up behind him, to ride as they had ridden through the storm. Instead, he cupped his hands for her foot and gestured for her to mount. She hesitated, then placed her boot in his hands and let him boost her into the saddle. She felt small and high up on the massive animal. Wyatt adjusted the stirrups for her, his movements practical and impersonal. Then he took the horse's reins in his hand. "We will go to Elk Hollow," he said. "You can find lodging there." And with that, he began to walk, leading the horse out from the shelter of the cliff into the brilliant, transformed world. The fury of the storm had been replaced by a breathtaking beauty. The sky was a vast, aching blue, as clear and fragile as glass. A fresh ocean of snow covered everything, sculpted by the wind into deep drifts and smooth plains. Every pine tree wore a heavy coat of white. Their branches bowed. The sun was intensely bright, making the endless fields of snow glitter with millions of tiny diamonds. The air was so cold and clean it hurt to breathe. It was a world washed new, a silent, pristine wilderness. Wyatt walked ahead, a dark, solitary figure breaking the first trail through the unmarked snow. He did not look back. He did not speak. He simply led the way, his stride long and tireless. Eleanor watched the steady rhythm of his broad shoulders, the way he moved through this immense and intimidating landscape as if he were a part of it. as if the mountains and the snow knew him. She felt a profound sense of dislocation. A woman from the flat, tamed fields of Kansas set down in a place of savage grandeur. They traveled for hours. The sun climbed high in the sky, warming the air just enough to make the journey bearable. Finally, in the distance, she saw a thin curl of wood smoke rising into the blue. As they drew closer, a small collection of buildings took shape, nestled in a shallow valley, Elk Hollow. It was not much of a town. A single dirt road, now covered in snow, ran through the center. On one side stood a small, white church with a humble steeple, its paint peeling. Next to it was a blacksmith's forge, silent for now, a pile of snow sitting on its cold anvil. Across the way was a long, low building with a swinging door that was unmistakably a saloon, and beside it, a larger structure with a porch and a sign that read, Elk Hollow Mercantile and Post Office. A few scattered cabins and one larger, two-story building with a neatly swept porch completed the settlement. As they entered the town, it was as if a silent bell had been rung. A man chopping wood stopped, his axe held in midair. A woman shaking a rug from a cabin doorway froze, her eyes wide. A curtain in the window of the mercantile twitched. Every eye in Elk Hollow turned toward them, toward her. Eleanor felt her spine stiffen. She was acutely aware of what they saw: a woman, alone, her dress wrinkled and torn, her hair a mess, riding into town on a massive black horse led by a giant of a man with a wild beard and a trapper's bearing. She could feel their thoughts, their swift and certain judgments, as sharply as the cold air on her cheeks. Her face burned with a shame she did not deserve but could not escape. Wyatt seemed completely unmoved by the attention. His pace did not change. His gaze did not waver from the path ahead. He led the horse to the two-story building. A small, hand-painted sign hung by the door. Rooms for let. Widow Jensen. Prop. He stopped the horse and looked up at her. Lodging, he said, as if stating the obvious. He put his hands on her waist to help her down. His touch was firm and brief, just enough to steady her as her feet touched the ground. Her legs felt weak after the long ride. He did not go to the door with her. He simply stood by the horse, a silent, imposing guardian, leaving her to face this next challenge alone. It was another choice he was giving her, another test of her own strength. Eleanor took a deep breath, smoothed her dress as best she could, and walked onto the porch before she could knock. The door opened. A woman stood there, thin and severe, her gray hair pulled back in a tight, unforgiving bun. She wiped her hands on a starched white apron, her eyes flicking from Eleanor to Wyatt and back again. "May I help you?" she asked. Her voice was as starched as her apron. "I would like to inquire about a room," Eleanor said, trying to keep her own voice steady and clear. The woman's gaze traveled over Eleanor's appearance. "Missing nothing. We run a respectable house here," she said. Her lips pursed. "I am a respectable woman," Eleanor replied, meeting the widow's hard stare. "I have had an accident with my wagon. I can pay for a room and board until I can find work." The widow considered this, her eyes still sharp with suspicion. "Work? What kind of work does a woman like you do?" "I can cook and I can clean, and I am very skilled with a needle." The mention of needlework seemed to slightly soften the widow's expression. She glanced once more at Wyatt, who had not moved a muscle. Finally, she gave a stiff nod. "The room is $2 a week, meals included. You will pay in advance, and there will be no visitors." She said the last part while looking directly at Wyatt. Eleanor reached into the small reticule that had, by some miracle, remained with her. She counted out $2 silver, her entire fortune, and placed them in the widow's waiting hand. The transaction was complete. She had a place. She turned to look at Wyatt. She wanted to say something more, to offer a payment, to express the depth of her gratitude, but words felt small and inadequate. He had saved her life. How could she ever repay that? He seemed to understand. He just gave her another one of his small, final nods. Then he turned, swung himself up onto his horse with practiced ease, and without a backward glance, rode out of town, a silent figure heading back toward the vast, white mountains. Eleanor watched him go until he was just a dark speck against the snow. Then she turned and followed Widow Jensen into the clean, cold, and judgmental quiet of the boarding house. Later that afternoon, after a meal of thin stew and a conversation that consisted of the widow's strict household rules, Eleanor knew she had to find work immediately. Her $2 would not last. The widow mentioned that Silas Croft, who ran the tannery and leather works at the edge of town, was a gruff man, but always in need of help. Eleanor found the tannery by its smell, a pungent, earthy mix of hide, chemicals, and wood smoke. It was a messy, masculine place. A man with a weathered face and a leather apron was scraping a large hide stretched on a frame. He was powerfully built, his forearms corded with muscle. He barely glanced at her as she approached. "I am looking for Silas Croft," she said. He grunted without looking up. "You found him. I was told you might have need of a sewer." He stopped his work then and looked at her. His eyes narrowed. He took in her clean but worn dress, her city soft hands. "I need someone who can stitch harnesses and saddles, thick leather. It is hard work for a woman." "My father was a cobbler," she said quietly. "He taught me to stitch leather before I ever stitched cloth. I am stronger than I look." Silas Croft snorted, a sound of pure disbelief, but there must have been something in her steady gaze he found compelling. He wiped his hands on his apron and gestured toward a workbench cluttered with tools and scraps. "Show me," he said. He picked up a thick piece of saddle leather, an awl, and a needle with a length of waxed thread already in it. Eleanor took the tools. Her hands felt clumsy at first, but then the old rhythms returned, the solid feel of the awl in her palm, the precise pressure needed to pierce the thick hide. She made a line of holes, evenly spaced. Then she took the needle and began to sew, using the two-handed stitch her father had taught her, pulling each stitch brutally tight. Her fingers already ached, but she did not slow down. She made a seam 2 inches long, her stitches small, straight, and perfectly even, a line of disciplined strength in the rugged leather. She handed the scrap back to him. Silas Croft took it and held it up to the light. He ran his thick thumb over the seam, testing its strength. He tried to pull the stitches apart, but they held firm. He looked from the leather back to her face, a new expression in his eyes. It was not kindness, but it was a form of respect. "Be here at sunup," he said, and turned back to his work. Eleanor walked back to the boarding house as the sun began to set, painting the snow-covered mountains in shades of pink and gold. Her fingers throbbed, but her heart was light. She had a room. She had a job. It was a small, precarious foothold, purchased with her last $2 and a 2-inch seam of thread. But it was hers. She looked out her small window at the quiet town and the wild mountains beyond. The storm was over. A different kind of struggle had just begun. The days at the tannery fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the leather. Sunup found Eleanor at her workbench, the air sharp with the tang of tanning liquors and the scent of raw hide. Silas Croft was a man of few words, and most of them were corrections. He taught her not with praise, but with grunts of disapproval or, on rare occasions, a silent nod that felt like a king's commendation. Her hands, once accustomed to fine cloth and delicate embroidery thread, were transformed. They became tough, calloused, and strong. She learned to read the leather, to feel the difference between supple deer hide destined for a lady's gloves and the thick, unyielding bull hide that would become a saddle tree. She learned to sharpen the curved blades of the skiving knives until they could peel a whisper-thin layer from the leather's edge, a skill that took weeks of practice and several deep cuts to master. Silas would only grunt and hand her a clean rag and a pot of foul-smelling salve. Her world became a place of textures and focused effort, The rough, hairy side of a hide and the smooth, tight grain of its finished surface, the satisfying scrape of the knife, the precise punch of the awl, the steady pull of waxed thread drawn tight. Each perfect stitch was a small victory, a mark of order she was imposing not just on the leather, but on the chaos of her own life. The straight, unwavering seams she sewed were a testament to a control she had never known before. She was not just mending leather. She was mending herself. Outside the tannery, the world was changing. One morning, a warm wind began to blow down from the mountains, a soft, insistent breath that was startling after weeks of biting cold. The Chinook, Silas called it, not looking up from a harness he was oiling. It was a snow eater. And it was. All day the warm wind blew, and the great silence of the snow was broken by a new sound, the gentle, persistent dripping of water. It ran in rivulets from the eaves of the tannery. From the laden branches of the pines, the thick blanket of white that had smothered the valley began to recede, revealing the dark, wet earth beneath. Patches of brown grass appeared on the sunny slopes, looking bruised and weary from their long burial. The world was thawing, and Eleanor felt an answering melt deep inside her. The hard, frozen knot of fear that had lived in her chest for so long began to loosen its grip. That evening, after a silent supper with Widow Jensen, Eleanor felt a strange restlessness. The small, clean room felt like a cage. She found herself looking out the window, toward the dark line of the forest that bordered the town. She knew he was out there. Wyatt. She had not seen him since the day he brought her to El Calo, but she knew he had not gone far. Sometimes, when the wind was right, she thought she could smell the faint, clean scent of his wood smoke. She had wrestled with the thought all week. She owed him her life, a debt so immense it was paralyzing. Yet he had asked for nothing, not even a word of thanks. He had simply delivered her from the storm and vanished. A part of her was terrified of seeing him again, of the obligation he represented. But a larger part, a part that was slowly waking up, felt a pull toward the quiet strength she had found in his presence. She wanted to know he was still there, a steady point in her new and uncertain world. On an impulse she could not explain, she put on the thin coat she had arrived in. It was not nearly warm enough, but it was all she had. She walked out of the boarding house, earning a sharp, questioning look from Widow Jensen, who was sweeping the porch. Eleanor simply nodded and kept walking, her head held high. She walked through the town's main street. A few men lingered outside the saloon, their talk and laughter stopping as she passed. Their eyes followed her, filled with a coarse curiosity that made her skin crawl. She ignored them, her gaze fixed on the darkening edge of the woods. She was the woman who had arrived with the big, silent man from the mountains. She knew what they were thinking, the crude stories they were telling themselves. Let them. Their words could not hurt her. She had survived a Wyoming blizzard. She could survive their whispers. As she reached the trees, the sounds of the town faded, replaced by the sighing of the wind in the pines and the drip, drip, drip of melting snow. She found a faint trail and followed it, her heart beating a little faster. What was she doing? What if he was not there? What if he did not want her there? Then she saw it, a flicker of orange light through the trees. The campfire. It was in a small, sheltered clearing, not far from the town but completely hidden from it. His camp was as simple and orderly as he was. The great black horse was tethered nearby, contentedly munching on some hay. A small canvas shelter was pitched against a rock outcropping, and Wyatt sat by the fire, sharpening a long knife on a whetstone. He looked up as she stepped into the clearing, but he showed no surprise. It was as if he had been expecting her. He did not smile or speak, just watched her approach with those steady gray eyes. Eleanor stopped a few feet from the fire, suddenly feeling foolish and intrusive. I just wanted to see if you were all right, she stammered. He finished drawing the blade across the stone, then tested the edge with his thumb. I am all right, he said. An awkward silence fell. Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself, shivering slightly in the cool evening air. He seemed to notice. "Sit," he said, gesturing with the knife toward a smooth log on the other side of the fire. She sat. A rabbit was roasting on a spit over the flames, its skin crackling and sizzling, filling the air with a delicious aroma. Wyatt took a small pot of coffee from the coals and poured some into his tin cup. He drank, then refilled it and held it out to her. She took it, grateful for the warmth. The coffee was still black, still bitter. It was the taste of him, of this wild place. They did not talk much. He asked nothing of her life in the town, and she asked nothing of his life in the mountains. They spoke of the Chinook wind, of the tracks of a deer he had seen that morning. The conversation was simple, grounded in the world around them. Yet, in the shared silence, Eleanor felt a profound sense of peace. Here, she did not have to pretend. She did not have to be the respectable seamstress or the subject of town gossip. She could just be a woman warming her hands by a fire. When the rabbit was cooked, he pulled it from the spit, carved it up with his newly sharpened knife, and handed her a portion on a piece of bark. They ate with their fingers. The hot, savory meat a welcome feast. As the fire burned down to glowing embers, the cold began to seep back into the clearing. Eleanor knew she should leave, return to her proper room at the widow's house. But she could not bring herself to move. She felt a deep reluctance to trade this quiet companionship for the lonely silence of her room. Wyatt stood and went to his canvas shelter. He returned with a heavy wool bedroll and spread it out in the same spot as before, a respectable distance from the fire. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "The nights are still cold," he said. It was a statement, not an invitation. The choice, as always, was hers. This time, there was no hesitation. She knew the terms of their arrangement. It was not about desire. It was about the simple, practical sharing of warmth. It was about trust. She gave him a small nod. He lay down as he had before, his back to her, a silent, unmoving shape. She waited a moment, then went and lay down on her side of the bedroll, pulling the heavy blanket over her. She shifted until her back was pressed lightly against his. The familiar, steady warmth spread through her, a comfort that went deeper than just chasing away the cold. It was the comfort of a presence that asked for nothing but gave what was most needed, a sense of safety. This became their ritual. Each day she worked at the tannery, her hands growing stronger, her stitches becoming more confident. The people of Elk Hollow began to see her not as a mysterious arrival, but as a part of the town's machinery. Women would stop her on the street to ask if she could mend a child's coat or patch a pair of work trousers. Men who had once stared at her with open speculation now nodded respectfully. They began to call her the seamstress with the neat stitch. Her work was her reputation, a shield against the whispers that still followed her each evening. For every evening, as dusk settled over the valley, she would walk the path to the edge of the forest. The whispers would follow her. The town saw a woman leaving her respectable lodgings to spend the night in the woods with a man who was not her husband. They could not understand the simple, silent arrangement, and so they filled the silence with their own stories. Eleanor felt their judgment, but it had begun to lose its power over her. Their opinions could not change the truth of her evenings. The quiet meal by the fire, the shared cup of coffee, the profound, respectful peace of lying back to back. Two solitary people sharing a small circle of warmth against the vast, cold darkness of the world. She began to wonder about him, about the life he had lived that had forged him into this man of unbreakable principles. She found herself watching his hands, the way he moved. The rare moments a flicker of something like a smile touched his eyes when his horse nudged his shoulder. She knew she was becoming a burden. He had to hunt for two now, provide firewood for a longer burning fire. Yet he never showed any sign of resentment. He simply provided, but the question haunted her nights. Was she a weight he carried out of a stubborn sense of duty, or was there something more in his silence? Something that welcomed her presence as much as she welcomed his? She did not know. And in the quiet space between them, She did not dare to ask. The deep, clinging mud of winter gave way to the soft, yielding earth of spring. The air, which for months had been a blade in the lungs, was now soft and carried the scent of damp soil and the sharp, clean fragrance of new pine needles. The sun had a gentle warmth, and the days grew longer, stretching out like a lazy cat. In the tannery, the heavy winter hides were replaced with the lighter skins, and the rhythm of Eleanor's work shifted with the season. Her stitches were as neat as ever, her hands as strong, but the desperate, driving need for survival that had fueled her through the winter had eased into a steady, quiet competence. Her evening walks to Wyatt's camp were no longer a flight from the town's judgment, but a calm passage into a different kind of peace. The path was no longer treacherous with ice, but soft with fallen needles. She came to know the sounds of the forest at dusk, the hoot of an owl from a high branch, the rustle of a small creature in the undergrowth, the sigh of the wind through the newly greening aspen leaves. Their routine had settled into a comfortable, unspoken pattern. She would arrive as he was tending the fire. He would pass her the cup of coffee, and she would sit on her log, warming her hands, watching him. Sometimes she would bring something from the town, a small loaf of bread from the mercantile, or a jar of preserves she had traded a mending job for. He would accept it with a slow nod, a silent acknowledgement of her contribution to their shared meal. They still spoke little, but the silence between them had changed. It was no longer a space of caution and uncertainty, but a shared territory, as comfortable and familiar as the firelight that danced between them. She learned the landscape of his quietness, the slight tightening of his jaw when he was concentrating, the way his eyes would soften when he looked at his horse, the almost imperceptible upward turn of his lips when the coffee was particularly strong. He, in turn, seemed to have learned the map of her own silences. He knew when she was tired from a long day's work, her shoulders slumped with fatigue. He knew when her thoughts were far away, her gaze lost in the flickering flames. And he would not disturb her. He had created a space where she did not have to explain or defend herself. He simply let her be. But as the world around them woke up, so did a new kind of awareness within Eleanor. The strict, practical boundary they had maintained through the winter now seemed less like a necessity and more like a deliberate, carefully guarded line. Lying back to back in the bedroll had once been a simple matter of survival, a sharing of warmth against a killing cold. Now, with the spring nights growing milder, the act felt different. The warmth was still there, a solid comfort against her back, but it was no longer just the absence of cold. It was his warmth. It was the heat of him, a living, breathing man. She found herself thinking of his hands. She had watched them perform 100 tasks. They could be brutal, splitting logs with a single, perfectly aimed blow of an axe. They could be skilled, dressing an animal with clean, precise cuts. And they could be surprisingly gentle, stroking his horse's neck or carefully tending a tiny flame into life. Yet those hands had never once lingered on her. When he helped her down from the horse or passed her a cup, his touch was always brief, impersonal, and correct. It was a stark contrast to the memories that still haunted her waking hours and her dreams' hands that grabbed, that held, that controlled. Hands that took without asking. Wyatt's restraint was a constant, unspoken reassurance, yet it was also a question. She had survived because of his principle not to leave someone in a storm. She stayed now because of his quiet companionship, but she did not know why he allowed it to continue. She did not know what she was to him, a responsibility, a charity case, or something else entirely. The not knowing was a small, persistent ache in her heart. One evening, the air was particularly soft, the sky a deep, star-filled violet. A small fire crackled between them, the wood seasoned and dry, burning with a steady, hypnotic glow. The embers pulsed like a slow heartbeat. Wyatt was looking into the flames, his bearded face cast in shadow and light, his expression thoughtful. Eleanor watched him, the question she had held inside for so long rising until she could no longer contain it. Her own heart hammered against her ribs, a counterpoint to the slow pulse of the fire. "Wyatt," she said, her voice softer than she intended, little more than a whisper. He did not turn his head, but she knew he was listening. His stillness was a form of attention. She took a breath, forcing the words out into the quiet space between them. "Why have you never touched me first?" The question hung in the air, fragile and immense. The crackle of the fire seemed to grow louder in the sudden, charged silence. She had laid bare the central mystery of their time together, the thing that both protected and confounded her. She immediately wanted to take the words back, to bury them in the comfortable quiet they had shared. She had crossed a line, and she did not know what she would find on the other side. He did not answer for a long time. He continued to gaze into the fire, his big shoulders perfectly still. She thought perhaps he had not heard her, or had chosen to ignore the question entirely. She looked down at her hands, her face burning with shame. Then he spoke, his voice a low rumble, as deep and steady as the earth beneath them. He did not look at her. He kept his eyes on the fire, as if the answer were written there in the glowing coals. "Because you have not said I could." The words were simple. They were plain. They were offered without drama or sentiment. But for Eleanor, they were a revelation. They landed in the center of her being and shattered the last, thick wall of ice that had surrounded her heart. She thought of the men she had known, of a world where wants were simply taken, where a woman's body was a territory to be claimed. She thought of the constant, weary vigilance of her old life, the need to always be on guard against a hand that might stray, a voice that might command. And here was this man, this quiet giant, who had held her life in his hands. He had every advantage of strength and solitude. He could have done anything, but his own code, his own profound and unshakable respect for her, was stronger than any advantage. He had been waiting for her word. He had given her a power she did not know she possessed, the power of her own voice. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and sharp, but they were not tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of a deep, overwhelming relief, a release of a tension she had carried for so long she had forgotten it was there. He had not just saved her from the storm. He was saving her from the ghosts that had followed her into it. She looked at him then, truly looked at him, not as a rescuer or a guardian, but as a man of impossible patience and quiet dignity, a man who understood that a person's soul needed its own space, its own boundaries, and that those boundaries could only be crossed by invitation. She cleared her throat, her voice thick with emotion. "I am not cold anymore," she said. It was the truth, in every sense. The spring air was mild on her skin. But more than that, the deep, internal chill of her past was finally, truly gone. The warmth she sought now was not for survival. It was a choice, a desire. She stood up from her log and walked around the fire. She sat down beside him, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. She waited. Her breath held. He turned his head and looked at her. For the first time, his gray eyes were not unreadable. She saw in them a question, a silent seeking of permission. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if he were handling something infinitely fragile. He raised his arm and settled it around her shoulders. It was not a casual gesture. It was a placement. His arm was heavy, solid, and wonderfully warm. It did not pull her closer. It did not restrain her. It simply rested there, an offer of comfort and presence. She leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. The rough wool of his shirt was scratchy against her cheek. He smelled of wood smoke, pine, and the clean scent of the night air. It was the smell of safety, of home. They sat like that for a long time, in a new kind of silence. It was not the silence of two strangers, nor the comfortable silence of two companions. It was the deep, resonant silence of two people who had finally found a common language, a language spoken not with words, but with patience, with trust, and with the quiet, revolutionary power of a simple choice. The fire burned down, the embers glowing long into the night, a testament to the slow, steady heat that had finally been allowed to burn free. The new intimacy that had bloomed between them in the firelight did not vanish with the morning sun. It settled into the quiet spaces of their lives, a gentle warmth that Eleanor carried with her throughout the day. When she worked at her bench in the tannery, the memory of his arm around her shoulders was a silent strength. Her stitches, if it were possible, became even more sure, her movements more confident. The townspeople of Elk Hollow noticed the change. The hunted, wary look in her eyes had been replaced by a calm self-possession. She met their gazes directly now, and the whispers, though they did not cease entirely, lost their venomous edge and became tinged with a grudging respect. Their evenings together by the fire were different, too. She no longer sat on a separate log across from him. She sat beside him, their shoulders sometimes brushing. A simple, comfortable contact that spoke volumes. He still did not talk much, but he would watch her, a soft light in his gray eyes that had not been there before. He had begun to open up in small, almost imperceptible ways. He told her the names of the constellations that wheeled above them in the clear mountain sky. He pointed out the different calls of the night birds. He was showing her his world, not with grand pronouncements, but with small, shared details. One afternoon, as Eleanor was finishing a set of saddlebags, the rhythmic sound of her stitching was broken by an unfamiliar noise from the main street. It was the slow, tired clip-clop of a horse that had been ridden hard and long. Horses were a constant presence in Elk Hollow, but this one sounded different. It lacked the steady, purposeful gait of a local rider. Silas Croft looked up from the harness he was mending, a frown creasing his brow. Eleanor glanced out the wide, open doorway of the tannery. A rider was coming down the street, a man who did not belong, while the men of Elk Hollow wore practical, sturdy clothes of buckskin and wool. This man was dressed in a dark, tailored coat, now dusty and trail-worn. He wore a city hat, a fedora, set at a precise angle on his head. His horse was a fine-boned bay, but its head was low with exhaustion, its coat matted with sweat and dust. The man reined in his horse in front of the mercantile, his gaze sweeping the small town with an air of dismissive appraisal. He dismounted stiffly, a man not used to long hours in the saddle. A cold, familiar dread coiled in Eleanor's stomach. It was a feeling she had thought she had left behind in the Kansas dust. She knew him. The man, Alistair Finch, brushed the dust from his sleeves and walked into the mercantile. Eleanor's hands had frozen over her work, the needle poised in midair. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. What was he doing here? How had he found her? It was impossible. She had covered her tracks, sold her belongings for passage on a wagon train heading vaguely west. She had been nobody, a ghost slipping away in the night. But Alistair had always had a terrifying persistence. He was a man who saw the world as a collection of things that belonged to him, and he did not suffer his possessions to go missing. The news of his arrival spread through Elk Hollow with the speed of a prairie fire. It did not need to be shouted. It traveled in the sudden silence of the men outside the saloon, in the way Widow Jensen, who had been beating a rug on her porch, abruptly stopped and went inside. It moved in the twitching of curtains and the quick, hushed conversations that sprang up and then died as Eleanor came into view. Silas Croft had seen the look on her face. He put down his tools. "Who is he?" he asked, his voice a low growl. "He is my past," Eleanor whispered, her own voice sounding thin and strange to her ears. The door to the mercantile opened and Alistair emerged, followed by the proprietor, a man whose face was a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Alistair held a piece of paper in his hand. He looked directly across the street, his eyes locking onto the dark opening of the tannery. He had known where to find her. "He wants his wife back," the proprietor called out, his voice loud enough for the whole street to hear. Says he has the papers to prove it. Says the law is on his side. A small crowd began to gather. They were not hostile, not yet. They were curious, hungry for a drama to break the monotony of their lives. They were an audience, waiting to see how the play would unfold. Eleanor felt their collective gaze, the weight of their judgment. She was once again the strange woman, the subject of their speculation. She saw Wyatt then. He must have been coming into town from the woods, for he appeared at the edge of the street, his stride long and unhurried. He took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance, Alistair standing like a conqueror in front of the mercantile, the paper in his hand, the gathering crowd, and her, a frozen silhouette in the shadows of the tannery. He did not break his stride. He walked steadily, purposefully, through the silent crowd, which parted for him as if he were a force of nature. He did not go to Alistair. He did not draw the Colt revolver that rested on his hip. He walked to the tannery and stopped, leaning one broad shoulder against the doorframe. He crossed his arms over his chest and waited. He said nothing. He did not have to. His presence was a statement, a solid, unmovable fact. His hand rested near the worn leather of his holster, a silent, deadly promise. He was not taking charge of the fight. He was standing guard over her right to have one. Alistair's confident sneer faltered for a fraction of a second as he looked at the sheer size of the man who now blocked the doorway, but his arrogance quickly returned. He was a man who believed in the power of paper and the weight of the law, not the primitive authority of muscle and steel. "Eleanor," he called, his voice smooth and proprietary. The voice she had heard in her nightmares. "This foolishness has gone on long enough. It is time to come home." Eleanor's first instinct was to shrink back, to retreat into the shadows of the tannery where it was safe. She could feel the old fear, cold and slick, rising in her throat, threatening to choke her. His voice was a key that unlocked all the cages she had built around her memories. But then she looked at Wyatt. He was not looking at her. His gray eyes were fixed on Alistair, level and implacable. He was a wall at her back, a silent testament to a different kind of strength, a different kind of man. He was not her champion. He was her ally. He was waiting for her. Something inside her shifted. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her belly, but something else rose to meet it, a hot, clean anger. An anger at this man who thought he could walk back into her life and claim it, as if she were a lost piece of luggage, an anger at the frightened woman she had been. She put down her needle. She wiped her hands on her apron. She took a deep breath, and she walked out of the shadows into the bright, unforgiving sunlight. She did not stop behind Wyatt, seeking his protection. She walked onto the low wooden porch of the tannery and stood beside him, her shoulder just inches from his arm. She was no longer hiding. She was a partner, standing on the boundary line between her past and her future. She looked at Alistair, at his polished shoes and his self-satisfied smile. He no longer seemed powerful to her. He just seemed small and out of place in this vast, rugged land. Her voice, when she spoke, did not tremble. It was clear and steady, and it carried across the silent street. "I walked through a blizzard and did not die," she said, her words dropping like stones into the quiet. "You do not scare me anymore." The simple, declarative statement was more powerful than any weapon. It was the truth. He had held power over her through fear, intimidation, and the suffocating confines of the world he had built around her. But she had faced a far greater power. She had faced the vast, impersonal cruelty of nature at its worst. And she had survived. The petty tyranny of one man was nothing next to the howl of a Wyoming storm. Alistair's face, for the first time, showed a flicker of genuine shock, then rage. The paper in his hand trembled. He had expected tears, pleading, a frightened submission. He had not expected this calm, unbreakable strength. "You are my wife," he hissed, his voice losing its smooth veneer. "The law says—" "This is not Kansas," Eleanor said, her voice cutting him off. "The law here is different." She looked at the faces in the crowd, at Widow Jensen, at the men from the saloon, at the women who had given her mending to do. She was not just speaking to Alistair. She was speaking to all of them, declaring her independence. I have a trade. I have a home. I am not your property. Alistair looked from her defiant face to the silent, menacing figure of Wyatt. He looked at the watching townspeople, their expressions no longer merely curious, but something harder, more assessing. He was a man who understood power, and he could feel it shifting away from him, leaving him exposed and ridiculous. His piece of paper was worthless here. His authority was an illusion. For a long moment, he stood frozen, his face a mask of fury and humiliation. Then, with a choked sound of disgust, he crumpled the paper in his fist. He turned without another word, strode to his exhausted horse, and pulled himself into the saddle. He yanked savagely on the reins, turning the animal, and spurred it into a clumsy trot, riding out of town the same way he had come in. The crowd watched him go. No one spoke. They watched until he was a small, dusty figure disappearing down the trail. Then, slowly, the spell was broken. People began to talk in low murmurs, turning back to their own business. The show was over. Eleanor stood on the porch, her legs trembling now that the danger had passed. She had done it. She had faced her ghost and had not flinched. She had spoken her own truth in front of the whole world, and the world had listened. She felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Silas Croft. He looked at her, then at Wyatt, and gave a single, gruff nod. It was the highest praise he knew how to give. She turned to Wyatt. He was finally looking at her, and in the depths of his steady gray eyes, she saw something she had never seen before, a fierce, quiet pride. He had known she could do it. He had waited for her to find the strength that he had seen in her all along. He reached out, not to her shoulder, but to her hand, his large, calloused fingers closing gently around hers. It was the first time he had ever touched her first. It was not a gesture of possession, but of partnership, of arrival. The storm, both outside and in, was finally over. The departure of Alistair Finch did not cause a great stir in Elk Hollow, but it settled something. A question that had hung in the air was answered. A tension was released, and the town breathed a collective, quiet sigh. For Eleanor, it was as if the last ghost of winter had finally been banished. The spring that followed was not just a season of melting snow and greening leaves. It was a deep, internal thawing, a true beginning. The world felt new, and she felt new in it. The tannery, once a refuge, now felt like a stepping stone. She was grateful to Silas Croft for the work, for the gruff, unspoken respect he had shown her. But her hands, now skilled and strong, yearned to create things of her own. She had saved nearly every penny she earned, living frugally at the widow's boarding house. One day, she approached Silas, her heart beating a steady, confident rhythm. "I believe it is time for me to open my own shop," she said, her voice clear. "Mending and sewing, perhaps some small leather goods." Silas looked at her for a long moment, wiping his hands on his leather apron. He glanced at the neat, strong stitches on the bridle she was finishing. He then looked out at the town, which had come to accept her as one of its own. "About time," he grunted, and a rare, cracking smile touched his lips. "You will put every other seamstress in this territory out of business." He told her about a small, unused cabin behind the mercantile, its owner having long since moved on. It was little more than a shed, but it was sturdy and had a good window for light. The transaction was simple. A few dollars pressed into the hand of the mercantile owner. The cabin was hers. For the next week, she worked tirelessly. She scrubbed the floors until the pine boards gleamed. She patched the chinking between the logs. She built a sturdy workbench under the window. From Silas, she purchased a stock of leather and tools, paying him from her earnings. He gave her a fair price, throwing in a box of waxed thread and a set of fine needles for free. An act of generosity so uncharacteristic it almost brought tears to her eyes. The final touch was the sign. She found a smooth, weathered piece of pine wood and, using a hot iron from the blacksmith's forge, carefully burned the letters into the grain. It was not fancy. It was simple, clean, and clear. E. Ashford, seamstress. The E was for Eleanor, a name she was finally claiming as her own. The day she hung that sign over her door, securing it with 2 new nails, was the day she truly put down roots in Elk Hollow. She was no longer a woman running from something, but a woman building something. As she laid the foundation for her new life, Wyatt began to lay one of his own. His camp in the woods, once a temporary shelter, was abandoned on a gentle rise just beyond the town, where a grove of aspen trees shivered in the breeze. He started to build. He worked with a furious, focused energy, from sunup to sundown. The sound of his axe echoed through the valley, a steady, rhythmic heartbeat. He felled the straightest, strongest lodgepole pines, his movements a symphony of controlled power. He stripped the bark with a draw knife, the pale wood gleaming in the sun. He used his horse to drag the massive logs to the site he had cleared, a place that looked out over the town on one side and the vast, wild mountains on the other. Eleanor would watch him from her shop doorway. He was a force of nature, a man shaping the wilderness with his own 2 hands. He notched the logs with a precision that was breathtaking, each cut perfect so that they would fit together as if they had grown that way. Day by day, the walls of a small, sturdy cabin rose from the earth. It was not a large house, but it was solid, honest, and strong. Like the man building it, he worked through the day, and often, by the light of a lantern, he worked into the night. The steady tap, tap, tap of his hammer was a comforting sound, a lullaby of construction and permanence that drifted down into the town. He was building a home. The unspoken truth of it hung in the air between them, beautiful and terrifying. He had never said it was for her, for them. But every log he placed, every nail he drove, was a declaration louder than any words he could have spoken. One evening, the sun was sinking behind the mountains, flooding the valley with a soft, golden light. The day had been long and warm, and Eleanor was tired. But it was a good kind of tired. A woman had paid her handsomely for a new riding skirt, and a rancher had praised the repair she had made to his favorite saddle. She closed her shop, the small bell over the door giving a cheerful jingle, and began her walk. She did not go to the old campsite. She walked toward the new cabin. She crossed a meadow where the spring grass was new and impossibly green, dotted with the purple and yellow of wildflowers. The air was sweet with their scent. In the distance, she could see the cabin, its 4 walls up, the framework for the roof stark against the deepening orange of the sky. And she could see him, a dark silhouette moving against the light. He was on top of the walls, positioning one of the heavy rafters that would support the roof. He moved with a careful, balanced grace, his large frame sure and steady even at that height. He must have seen her coming. He finished setting the rafter, securing it in place, and then turned. He climbed down with an easy athleticism, swinging from the logs until his boots touched the ground. He walked to meet her, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. They met in the middle of the field of flowers, halfway between her new life in the town and the new life he was building on the hill. He stopped a few feet from her. He was covered in sawdust, his shirt stained with sweat. He smelled of fresh-cut pine, of honest labor, of the earth itself. The setting sun caught the glints of gold in his beard and lit his gray eyes with a warm, soft fire. She looked from his tired, content face to the cabin behind him, a solid promise taking shape against the sky. A wave of emotion so powerful it almost buckled her knees washed over her. It was gratitude. It was wonder. It was a love so deep and quiet it did not need a name. All the fear, all the running, all the cold nights had led her here, to this man, in this golden field. She stepped forward, closing the small distance between them. She did not say a word. She simply went to him, laying her head against his chest, her ear over the steady, strong beat of his heart. She wrapped her arms around his waist, holding onto him as if he were the only solid thing in the world. She breathed in his scent and felt a sense of peace so profound it was like coming home after a long and brutal journey. She leaned into the solid wall of his chest, a soft, warm sound escaping her lips, a sigh of pure contentment. Her whisper was sweet. For a moment, he stood perfectly still, as if her touch were a shock. Then, his arms came around her, pulling her against him. It was not the gentle, questioning hold he had used before. He held her with a lifetime of pent-up patience and unspoken need, a grip that was both fierce and tender. She felt the hard muscles of his back, the raw power he held in constant check. His need was fierce. She felt the deep shudder that ran through his body, a tremor of emotion from a man who so rarely showed any. He buried his face in her hair, his breath hot against her skin. "Stay," he said. The word was a gravelly prayer, a command that was also a plea. "You are my breath." His arms tightened, a silent, desperate promise. Never let her go. She tilted her head back, and he lowered his to meet her. His kiss was not gentle. It was like him honest, direct and overwhelming. It was the taste of coffee and wood smoke, of longing and relief. It was a kiss that spoke of lonely nights and silent patience, of a storm weathered and a safe harbor finally found. It was a kiss of equals, two survivors who had found in each other not just a rescue, but a reason. He lifted her then, as he had done once before in the blizzard, but this time it was different. He did not carry her as a burden, but as a treasure. He walked not to a temporary shelter, but toward the home he was building for them. They did not go inside the half-finished cabin. He led her to the place where the aspens grew, their leaves trembling in the evening breeze, making a sound like soft rain. He laid his coat on the new grass, and they lay down together under the watchful eyes of the first stars. Their coming together was as quiet and as natural as the turning of the season. It was an exploration, a rediscovery of a language their bodies had known they could speak but had waited for their hearts to learn. It was unhurried, a slow mapping of scars, both visible and hidden. It was an act of profound trust, a final, complete surrender of the fears that had kept them apart. It was two separate, lonely souls becoming one, not to be completed, but to be strengthened, to stand together against whatever wildness the world might still hold. They were not just sharing warmth against the cold anymore. They were lighting a fire that would burn for a lifetime. Life in Elk Hollow settled into a new rhythm, as gentle and as steady as the flow of the river that emerged from the melting snows. The sharp drama of Alistair's arrival and departure faded, leaving behind not a scar, but a kind of quiet clarity. The town had witnessed Eleanor's strength, and in a place where strength was the primary currency, it had bought her a new kind of standing. Her small shop behind the mercantile became a hub of quiet activity. She hung curtains made of cheerful yellow calico in the window, a bright spot of color against the weathered gray logs. Inside, she arranged her workspace with a meticulous order that was a reflection of the new order in her own soul. Spools of thread were lined up by color, needles and awls were set in neat rows, and bolts of cloth were stacked on clean shelves. The cabin smelled of new fabric, warm ironing, and the faint, pleasant scent of beeswax she used on her heavy thread. Her first customers were tentative, women from the surrounding ranches who needed a sturdy pair of trousers mended or a church dress altered. Eleanor's work spoke for itself. Her stitches were small and even, her patches nearly invisible, her seams stronger than the original. Word spread, soon. Her days were filled with the steady snip of scissors and the rhythmic punch of the needle. One afternoon, the bell over her door jingled, and Widow Jensen walked in. She stood stiffly in the center of the small room, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. She held out a bundle of her starched white aprons. One of them had a small, clean tear near the pocket. "I find I am in need of your services," the widow said, her voice as crisp as ever. It was the closest she would ever come to an apology, or an admission that her initial judgment had been wrong. "Of course," Eleanor replied, her own voice warm and even. She took the apron and examined the tear. "It will be an easy fix. I can have it for you by tomorrow." The widow nodded, her lips pursed. She placed a coin on the counter. "And I would like to commission a new set of curtains for my parlor. Something respectable. In a dark blue, perhaps." The transaction was a quiet turning point in accepting the widow's business. Eleanor was accepted into the fabric of the town's society, stitched into place not by marriage or birthright, but by the skill of her own two hands. The shadow of the woman who arrived in a blizzard was gone, replaced by E. Ashford, the seamstress. While Eleanor built her business, Wyatt built their home. The cabin on the hill was completed with the same steady purpose with which he did everything. He laid a floor of smooth, sanded pine boards. He built a great stone fireplace that drew perfectly, filling the single large room with warmth but not smoke. He crafted a sturdy table and 2 chairs, a bed frame in the corner. His work was not ornate, but it was honest and built to last. Each joint fitted perfectly, each surface sanded smooth. He was not just building a shelter, he was creating a sanctuary. He did not confine his work to their own small plot of land. As his cabin neared completion, he began to take on jobs for the ranchers in the valley. A man's fence line was down after a winter of heavy snows. Wyatt spent 2 days resetting the posts and stretching new wire, his movements economical and tireless. Another rancher struggled to get water to a dry pasture. Wyatt studied the lay of the land, then spent a week with a pick and shovel, digging a neat, efficient irrigation ditch that brought the life-giving water exactly where it was needed. He never asked for a set wage. He worked, and when the job was done, he accepted what was offered, usually a side of beef, a sack of flour, or a few chickens. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke a language the frontier understood. He was fair, he was reliable, and his work was impeccable. The men who had once looked at him with suspicion as the wild man from the mountains now greeted him with a nod of respect. He was no longer an outsider. He was a neighbor. The gossip that had once followed Eleanor like a shadow slowly starved from lack of fuel. The story of her and Wyatt was no longer a scandalous mystery. It was simply a fact of life in Elk Hollow. The seamstress lived in her shop in town. The quiet man lived in his cabin on the hill, and every evening, the seamstress closed her shop and walked up the hill to the cabin. There was no shame in it, no secrecy. It was just the way things were. Their consistency and their quiet dignity had defeated the whispers. They had become, simply, Eleanor and Wyatt, people of Elk Hollow. Their life together settled into a comfortable routine that became the bedrock of their world. In the evenings, after Eleanor closed her shop, she would walk the soft path through the meadow of wildflowers. She would often find him sitting on the new porch he had built, watching the sun set, his long knife and a piece of wood in his hands, carving a small, intricate animal or a useful tool. He was never idle. She would sit beside him, and they would watch the last light fade from the sky, the valley sinking into purple shadow. Sometimes they would talk, their conversations brief and to the point, about her day at the shop or a set of deer tracks he had seen. More often, they would sit in a comfortable silence, a shared peace that needed no words. These evenings were when the last vestiges of Eleanor's old fears and insecurities finally fell away. The constant, low-grade anxiety that had been her companion for years was soothed by the simple, reliable presence of this man. With him, she was not an object to be possessed or a problem to be solved. She was simply herself, and that was enough. Her work gave her a sense of purpose and value in the eyes of the world. Wyatt's quiet love gave her a sense of value in her own eyes. They would eat their supper on the porch when the weather was fine. It was a shared effort. She would bring bread she had baked on the small stove in her shop, or a pie made from wild berries. He would provide meat from his hunts, roasted over the fire or stewed with potatoes and onions. Their meals were simple, hearty, and eaten with a quiet appreciation. One evening, as they sat on the porch, a full moon rising over the mountains, Eleanor watched him as he ate. A small, genuine smile touched his lips as he tasted the berry pie she had made. It was a rare sight, a brief flash of unguarded happiness that made her own heart ache with a sweet, protective love. These small moments, these quiet rituals, were the threads that wove their two separate lives into a single, strong tapestry. This was not the life she had imagined when she fled Kansas, but it was more real, more solid, and more deeply satisfying than any of her desperate dreams of freedom. She realized then that the wooden sign on her shop and the sturdy cabin on the hill were not two separate places. They were two rooms of the same home. One was the place where she earned her bread and her independence. The other was the place where she shared her heart. Both were built on a foundation of respect, hard work, and the quiet courage it took to build a new life from the ashes of an old one. She was sewing a wedding veil for the blacksmith's daughter, a delicate thing of fine netting and tiny seed-pearl flowers. Her fingers, which had grown so strong and calloused from working with leather, moved with a surprising delicacy, creating stitches so small they were nearly invisible. She thought about the nature of the stitch, how its purpose was to hold things together, to be strong without being seen. It was like the bonds she had formed here, the invisible threads of respect from the townspeople, the unspoken, unbreakable connection she shared with Wyatt. Her life was no longer a torn and tattered garment. It was whole cloth, mended and made stronger than ever by 1,000 tiny, patient stitches. She held the veil up to the light, and, for the first time, she saw not the ghosts of her past, but the bright, clear promise of her future. The season turned, as it always did in the high country, with a quiet, decisive click. The lush, deep green of summer gave way to the pale gold of autumn. The aspen leaves, which had trembled like 1,000,000 tiny green coins in the breeze, turned a brilliant, fiery yellow, and the slightest wind would send them down in a shimmering shower. The air grew crisp and thin, carrying the sharp, clean scent of pine and the distant, dusty smell of the coming cold. It was a season of harvest, of gathering in, of preparing for the long sleep of winter. Eleanor's shop was a small, warm beacon of industry in the changing world. The bell over her door jingled constantly now. With winter approaching, the people of Elk Hollow and the surrounding ranches were in need of mended coats, new wool shirts, and sturdy canvas repairs. Her work table was perpetually covered in the stuff of their lives, a child's worn blanket, a cowboy's leather chaps, a mother's Sunday dress. She worked from sunup until the light failed, her needle a constant, flashing shuttle, weaving her life into the community, stitch by steady stitch. The last of her self-doubt, that persistent, whispering ghost, had been banished by the simple, undeniable fact of her own competence. She was no longer a refugee. She was the best seamstress in the valley, and everyone knew it. Wyatt, his own cabin now a complete and solid fact upon the hill, continued to weave himself into the life of the valley in his own way. He was a man who saw what needed doing and simply did it. He helped the blacksmith reshoe a team of difficult mules, his quiet strength calming the animals more effectively than any shouted command. He rode with a rancher to round up stray cattle that had wandered into the high country, his knowledge of the mountains proving invaluable. He did not seek out the work. The work seemed to find him. He had become a part of the landscape, as reliable and as necessary as the river that ran through the valley floor. The path between her shop and his cabin was now a well-worn ribbon of pale earth, a testament to their daily journey. It was a path worn by footsteps, not cut by a shovel, a natural consequence of two lives moving toward each other. Every evening, as the autumn light turned the golden grass to bronze, Eleanor would close her shop and walk that path. It was a pilgrimage of sorts, a quiet journey from her world of commerce and community to their world of shared peace. One evening, the air was perfectly still, the silence broken only by the brittle rustle of dry leaves. As she walked, she watched a herd of deer move gracefully across a distant hillside, their coats the same tawny gold as the grass. The whole world seemed to be holding its breath, poised in a moment of perfect, transient beauty. She saw him as she cleared the meadow. He was on the roof of the porch, a small, dark figure against the vast, pale sky. He was hammering, the sound sharp and clear in the still air. She stopped at the edge of the yard she now thought of as her own, and watched him. He was driving the last shingle nail into the porch roof. He worked with the same focused, unhurried grace she had come to know so well. He selected a nail, placed it, and drove it home with 3 clean, efficient blows. Tap, tap, tap. The last blow had a sound of finality, a full stop at the end of a long and arduous sentence. He remained there for a moment, his hammer resting on the new shingles, and looked out over the valley. He was not just looking at the land. He was a part of it. He was a man who had built his place in the world with his own 2 hands, with his own sweat, with the unbending strength of his own character. Eleanor watched him, and a feeling of such profound peace settled over her that it was almost overwhelming. She thought of the woman she had been, huddled in the blizzard, a creature of pure fear and desperation, convinced she was nothing, that her life was a tattered ruin. And she looked at the life she had now, the small, thriving business with her own name on the sign, the respect of the townspeople, and this man, this quiet, steady, honorable man, who had seen her not as a broken thing to be fixed, but as a person to be sheltered, and then to be trusted. She whispered the words to the golden evening air, a soft, private acknowledgement of a truth that had taken a lifetime to learn. This time, she spoke only to herself. Enough. The word was not about possessions. It was not about safety or comfort, though she had both. It was a deeper thing. It was the quiet, triumphant realization that she, Eleanor Ashford, was whole. She was not defined by the man who had wronged her, nor by the woman she had been forced to be. She was defined by the neat stitches of her trade, by the strength in her hands, by the courage it had taken to walk out of the shadows and into the sun. She was enough, all on her own. And the love she shared with this man was not a crutch for a wounded soul, but the meeting of 2 complete people who chose, every day, to walk the same path. Wyatt must have sensed her presence. He turned, saw her standing there, and a slow smile, the kind she had come to cherish, spread across his face. He climbed down from the roof, his movements sure and easy. He came to her, his boots silent on the soft grass. He did not speak. He simply reached out and took her hand. His hand was rough and calloused, but it fit hers perfectly. They stood like that for a long moment, hand in hand, 2 small figures in a vast and beautiful landscape. They were not 2 separate people anymore, the woman from the town and the man from the mountains. They were a single unit, a partnership forged in a blizzard and tempered by patience and trust. Together, they turned and began to walk the path between their 2 homes, the small shop and the sturdy cabin. The frontier was still the frontier. The world beyond their small valley was still a place of uncertainty and danger. The blizzards would come again, and the summer sun would be hot and unforgiving. There would be drought, and there would be wild animals, and there would always be the greed and foolishness of men. There were no guarantees of an easy life. But they had what mattered. They had a roof over their heads, a home built with their own hands. They had their work, their skills, their place in the community. They had their principles, the quiet, unspoken code that guided their lives. And they had each other. As they walked through the golden field, their shadows stretching long behind them in the setting sun, they walked toward a future that was unwritten, but one they would face together, side by side. Freedom, Eleanor now knew, was not found in running away. It was found in the quiet, courageous act of building a place to stay. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect, and be sure to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and press the hype button to help this story reach more people.